Joining us now is Matthew Soerens, Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at World Relief, and a Christian organization that works closely with the immigrant and refugee communities across the country. Matthew, always good to see you. Thank you for being with us today. So, a lot of these recent moves on immigration following the National Guard shooting and the Somali fraud allegations in Minnesota. What is your reaction, Matthew, to how the administration has handled all of it so far, and they're making the case that this is really about national security?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, first of all, we are just devastated by this horrific crime in Washington, D.C., and grieving for the victims, their families, praying for the healing of the guardsmen who's still in the hospital. And we want to see justice done, for the individual who's alleged to have perpetrated this crime. But I think our concern is that our government would go beyond punishing the individual who has committed a crime and punish potentially thousands or tens of thousands of people who have absolutely nothing to do with the crime. So when you look at all people from 19 different countries of nationality, and those are, not just the country from which this perpetrator allegedly came, but one of those countries is Burma. That's the top country of origin for refugee resettlement over the last 2 decades. And most of those refugees are Christians persecuted for their faith. So the effects of these counter policies could actually be very significant for people who had absolutely nothing to do with this horrific crime.
Yeah, it does raise a lot of questions about vetting here in the United States. Back when the withdrawal from Afghanistan was happening, a lot of lawmakers, including then Senator J.D. Vance, were talking about this being a problem, the lack of vetting for some of these people. So I think that that may be an issue that we continue to see. ICE raids targeting. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say on that point, I mean, we've actually at World Relief called for a bill called the Afghan Adjustment Act for several years now, because actually the individual who's alleged to have perpetrated this crime didn't come in as a refugee. The refugee vetting process is actually a distinct process, and the Afghan Adjustment Act would actually, it's a bipartisan bill with Republican and Democratic co-sponsors, would require those Afghans who came in during that early period to go through that refugee vetting process standard in the process of applying for permanent legal status. And we still think that bill is very much appropriate and actually overdue.
Yeah, we'll see if Mike Johnson might be able to bring that up. I think it's a hot topic right now for sure. Matthew, I want to talk to you about the situation in Minnesota with the Somali immigrants. ICE raids targeting the Somali immigrants there are underway in Minnesota. It comes after prosecutors say a group of Somalis stole hundreds of millions of dollars from Minnesota's social services system. They also believe some of that money could have been funneled to terrorists overseas. President Trump has said some very strong words. He's had some very harsh words saying Somali immigrants have destroyed Minnesota, that they should be out of here. That's a quote. I guess, Matthew, what's your response just to the situation, and are you hearing anything from immigrants directly affected in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways it's a similar circumstance where the people who are guilty of a crime should absolutely face prosecution and face punishment. We shouldn't punish an entire nationality for the offenses of a few individuals. The vast majority of Somalis living in Minnesota are lawfully present immigrants. Or actually, the large majority are naturalized citizens, if not native-born citizens. And it's just not fair to dehumanize a whole group of people. I mean, the language we've heard has been calling people garbage. From a Christian perspective, every human being is made in the image of God. That doesn't mean we should not expect our government to prosecute crimes and seek justice. We absolutely affirm that. But we need to be really careful as Christians. I mean, in James, it tells us to not be praising God with our mouth at one moment and cursing people made in his image. So we need to be really careful about dehumanizing language. And in Ezekiel, it talks about the one who sins should be the one who's punished. So this idea of sort of collective punishment of an entire people group is not, I think, a biblical principle, and not what usually has been the standard of American law either.
Yeah, in the situation in Minnesota, it is a political issue as well. Democrats are being accused of buying the Somali vote, where they're traditionally a bit more socially conservative. School choice is actually their number one issue. So there's that. It's also a political issue, I suppose. There, the administration has also proposed, and you got into this a little bit. Halting immigration from several countries: Afghanistan, Iran, Sudan, just a few. Are these countries? There are a lot of Christians in some of these countries. What does this mean for these believers living in these countries?
Yeah, again, I think if we take a blunt approach as a government and say we're going to ban all people from specific countries, uh, that ends up with harming people who are persecuted for their faith, who have historically actually been the priority. For example, from Iran, the refugee resettlement program coming out of Iran, the majority of refugees being resettled have been Christians for many years, and most of the rest have actually been other religious minorities facing persecution, because unfortunately, Iran horrifically persecutes religious minorities. And if you blanket ban all migration from a country like that, we end up shutting out the persecuted church. We end up shutting out others who are fleeing from religious persecution. So we think we need a good vetting. We affirm that absolutely. But these kind of blunt approaches end up harming far more people, and frankly, end up harming a lot of our brothers and sisters in Christ. I mean, the president actually said at one point in a social media post, all third world migration. I don't know exactly what that term, which countries fit that category, but that's very clearly the majority of the global church live in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East. And we think we need to have security. Absolutely. We affirm that. But we also need to stand with our brothers and sisters in Christ and with others who are fleeing persecution around the world.
Matthew, specifically, how should Christians here in the United States, should the church respond? What role should we be playing right now? And also, how do we find that balance between, yes, loving our neighbor, but also national security?
Yeah. I mean, I think now is a really important time for the church. I mean, the government has its role, and that includes ensuring national security. We absolutely affirm that. But the church's role is really to love our neighbors as ourselves, to stand with those who are persecuted, especially brothers and sisters in Christ, but others as well, and to make disciples of all nations and to see that opportunity with the arrival of people. I think one thing that's really important right now for the many churches around the United States that have been in relationship with immigrants, just to be reaching out and assuring them that we love you, we care about you, we see you as belonging here. We think that you belong here just as we do. You belong to the church the same way as we do. And that's an important message to convey when they may be feeling sort of a question of if they're not welcome in the current environment. I mean, you mentioned the enforcement in New Orleans as well. I'm in Chicagoland where we saw similar enforcement. We've seen church attendance at Spanish-speaking churches go down by 30% or more in a lot of churches. And in light of, again, a few people have done some really horrible actions, but the response has been to detain immigrants, only 5% of whom at this point have been convicted of a violent crime. So the large majority of the people who get caught up in this are actually not the worst of the worst that we hear about in the rhetoric.
Okay, Matthew Soerens with World Relief. Great to have you with us this evening. Thank you, Matthew.